In May 1960, Jerry E. Bishop wrote in the Wall Street Journal that an obscure sector of science, seismology, is suddenly being blasted into world attention. How did this come about? What were the effects on the practice and production of seismic knowledge? Seismology is a fairly young discipline. It only really began in the late 19th century. The 1920s and 1930s saw the first real generation of seismologists in the U.S. In the U.S. and around the world, the field had been focused on studying and attempting to predict earthquakes locally. By the 1930s, the field had shifted to studying global seismology and the structure of the Earth. At the time, the field was so small that there were 6 main researchers who trained the majority of PhD candidates. Until the 1950s, there were only 6 PhDs awarded on average a year, and less than 50 active researchers in the U.S. During the Second World War, seismological research had been disrupted to varying degrees. The majority of seismologists shifted their work to support the war effort. For example, Benno Gutenberg, a leading geophysicist who had been working on seismic waves and the structure of the Earth, worked as a technical advisor to the U.S. Navy to attempt to find a way to use seismic techniques to track hurricanes. After the war, most seismologists continued to study the causes and effects of earthquakes and the structure of the Earth's interior. Some also looked at improving seismic instrumentation and how to interpret seismographs. In terms of funding, the federal government expended about $500,000 a year, even in the late 1950s. Even during the International Geophysical Year, seismology only received about 2% of the U.S.'s IGY funds. Most of the money for seismology came from sponsors and insurance companies, for obvious reasons. As the idea of a nuclear test ban was bandied about, countries from the West and the East, primarily the Soviet Union and the United States, began to discuss possible control mechanisms for such a ban. In July 1958, scientists from the East and West met in Geneva to talk about a control system. Their report, published in August of that year, outlined a system composed of 180 stations worldwide to detect and identify explosions detonated in the atmosphere, underwater, in outer space, and underground. Already, it was clear that underground explosions would present the biggest obstacle. This was primarily due to the near impossibility of distinguishing the seismic signals of explosions from earthquakes. Further, at that point, there had only been one underground nuclear test, the Rainier test, and that was the basis of Western scientists' knowledge. This was further realized when, in the fall of 1958, as negotiations for a treaty were beginning in Geneva, the U.S. conducted a series of nuclear tests called the Hard Track series. The data made it clear that the Geneva system was less feasible than had been thought. In particular, scientists discovered the decoupling theory, essentially that the amplitude of a seismic signal could be dampened by a factor of up to 300 if a nuclear device was detonated in a large underground cavity. In a nutshell, the consensus among American seismologists was that the current seismic technology and knowledge was not advanced enough to monitor an agreement. They could not agree that 90% of all seismic events could be differentiated from explosions, nor could they guarantee detecting the seismic events in the first place. In 1958, the Berkner panel was tasked with reassessing the conclusions of the Conference of Experts. They issued a report which recommended a concerted program of basic research. Accordingly, in 1959, President Eisenhower instituted Project Vela, a research program geared toward advancing the sciences needed for the Geneva system. There were 3 aspects: Vela Sierra, which would focus on detonations on the surface of the Earth; Vela Hotel, using satellites to monitor detonations in the atmosphere; and Vela Uniform, to focus on underground detonations. The project would be managed by the Advanced Research Projects Agency at the Department of Defense, although the Atomic Energy Commission would take charge of nuclear tests. ARPA also worked with the Air Force Technical Application Center, which had been organizing seismograph stations since 1946. The U.S. Coast and Geodetic Service was responsible for organizing the worldwide seismic station network. Secretary of State Christian A. Herter said that a sizable and vigorous program of research and development is essential to the credibility before the world opinion of the present U.S. position on nuclear test cessation. In general, Soviet scientists tended to focus on the strengths of seismology, and the U.S. on the weaknesses. The Soviets had been willing to ban tests before there was a viable control system in place. They aimed to avoid on-site inspections, which, they claimed, if conducted without a treaty, would be used for espionage purposes by the U.S. and undermine their internal security. The U.S., on the other hand, wanted a control system in place, including on-site inspections, before signing an agreement. The U.S. was worried the Soviets would continue testing and advance ahead of the U.S. in nuclear technology. Even if the Soviets had agreed to large numbers of on-site inspections, it would still be necessary to identify where a seismic explosion had taken place. It was thought that this could encompass an area of anywhere between 20 and 400 miles with the seismic detection system scientists had proposed. In 2021, the U.S. government spent around $250 million on the program. As one historian has noted, seismology became a part of the academic military-industrial complex. Seismologists were recipients of multi-year contracts worth hundreds of thousands, even millions of dollars. It is important to note that most of VILA uniform was unclassified. Aside from bringing much-needed policing to a fundamental treaty, VILA was also a foreign policy initiative to show other nations that the U.S. was doing as much as they could to find a way to solve the nuclear test detection issue. The conclusions of the Berkner report were published in the New York Times, as were other new developments in seismic understanding. There is also clearly some positioning of U.S. scientists as being more objective and qualified than Soviet scientists, as illustrated by this cartoon. There was some consternation. In 1965, David Beard said that representatives of ARPA have made the statement that they bought the entire discipline of seismology when the issue of detection of underground nuclear tests came to their attention, and it is hard to disagree. On either end of the spectrum, scientists would either drop their own projects and start working on problems closer to detection, or use VILA money for their own projects. However, in most cases there was no difference between pursuing seismic detection and traditional seismic research. Importantly, the Berkner panel on which VILA uniform was based identified as problems the areas of study that seismologists were already working on. But these projects now had political force behind them. It was necessary to know more about the crust and to understand seismic wave propagation, as well as to investigate the microseismic background noise in order to detect and identify smaller seismic signals. Program managers at ARPA and its agents were the mediators between the Department of Defense and academics. ARPA had been created in 1959 as a direct response to Sputnik. Almost all of its directors were physicists or engineers. It oversaw a variety of projects ranging from missile defense to psychological warfare to seismological research. Spot the odd one out. VILA was its second largest project and received around a quarter of the annual budget. Although the U.S. President and the Secretary of Defense had influences on the ARPA mission as well as project budgets, they did not have any influence on negotiating contracts or grants. Even the ARPA director was not normally involved in the details. Instead, the chief of ARPA's VILA uniform branch, an oceanographer named Charles C. Bates, was given discretion. The majority of grants were given to institutions such as the Lamont Geological Observatory at Columbia and Caltech. It's clear that the countries involved were using science as a proxy for personal trust. They turned to science precisely because it seemed objective and mathematical. Although the concerted goal of VILA uniform was to find a way to police a test ban treaty, the program was focused on basic research. Essentially, scientists were given funding and support for following the course that they were already on. It appears that this derived from the nature of seismology and the connected goals of being able to detect and identify scientific blasts and understand the composition of the earth and wave propagation. In a sense, seismology profited from matters of circumstances. It was able to fill a void at the right time and position itself as a scientific but also practical discipline.